Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope you can stand another piece of paper. I think it'll help us deal with the issues which we need to deal with, and they're a little bit on the dry and formal side, at least to begin with. So perhaps have another cup of coffee, and that will do. Actually, I said a few words last evening about what I want to really concentrate on today, and that is on truth and why it is absolute or non-relative. And if you will forgive me, I'm going to be rather careful and slow. You might even think picky about this, but it really is a matter of getting us to very carefully focus our minds on something that great confusion has been created around. So if you now have the sheet and you care to begin to follow me there, there is a current crisis about truth in our world, but most especially in our university. It is somewhat ironic that in the 20s and 30s, for example, philosophers wrote books defending what is today called the absoluteness of truth and explaining the follies of thinking of it as relative. If you will, for example, look at an old book by an old philosopher by the name of W.P. Montague called The Ways of Knowing. You can be sure it is in your library because it was very well known and widely used at the time. The Ways of Knowing. I believe it's chapter 3, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, you'll be able to find it just by looking at the index. You'll see a very careful discussion of the idea that truth might be relative and a way of understanding why people might be led to that mistake. And actually, among philosophers of the traditional variety, the idea that truth might be relative is an opinion which is frankly laughable. The situation we have come to where this becomes an issue is very recent and has to do with political and social ideals that have felt the idea that truth as something absolute is threatening and difficult to deal with and keep what you regard as your human dignity in place because after all it's not a very comfortable position to be wrong, is it? And so if you're faced with a situation where you're told, in the words of Aristotle, that there are many ways to be wrong, only one way to be right. That immediately sounds antisocial in our context, doesn't it? And if you're deeply worried about this, and you have perhaps been marginalized, as we now say, you may have the idea that the one who's going to turn out to be wrong is you. And these are deep issues. Now, and I want you to understand that I understand that they are deep issues and difficult issues. I'm not dismissing them. And currently I'm just pointing out that there is a deep social drive against the idea of truth as being one way. Now this has created real problems for us in the intellectual world. And I don't hesitate to say that nearly all, I would say all, but I just don't want to have to argue about one case. I would say nearly all of our fields of professional practice are in epistemic crisis. That is to say, in nearly all of our fields of practice, law, education, theology, medicine, in nearly all of our fields of practice, instead of going for knowledge, what we go for is accepted practice. And so what we have is, as one social critic of a few years ago said, standardization without standards. And standardization is necessary in order to stay out of trouble with your clients, your colleagues, and the law. But you don't have to have truth for that, and you don't have knowledge for that. You only have to follow accepted practice. And the current crisis of truth in our world generally, and in this regard, the universities are certainly at the center, has to do with the fact that we no longer have a point of appeal that is common, objective, able to provide a common ground for basis of discussion and interaction. And so in the absence of that, we replace, as is often done in discussions in the universities today, we say it is not an issue of truth, it is not an issue of logic, it is an issue of power. And in a very ironic way, Nietzsche triumphs, who at the end of the 19th century, in a very prophetic way, read how the intellectual winds were blowing and said that the final word in every area of human life is not truth, not knowledge, but power. So there is a real crisis here now, and I want to just turn aside and take us back to some very elemental things and try to help us focus on truth itself. In many contexts, this is laughable immediately. But I want to try to remove it from that, and I require, I'm afraid, great patience on your part to try to follow me over some very simple things. So I start with the point on your page there that everyone knows perfectly well what truth is. And I want to ask you to think about that with me for a few minutes. Imagine that you were not able to distinguish truth from falsity. Try to put yourself in the world where you were unable to take your own thoughts and determine whether or not they're true. Consider the simple cases. Suppose you're looking for your car keys or your shoes, and you have a thought that you left your car keys in the garage. And now, is it within your competence as a human being to determine whether or not that thought is true? What do you think? Can you determine whether or not that thought is true? How would you do it? You would take that thought where the object is thought to be, and you would compare that thought to the object. Isn't that true? And if you you thought your shoes were in the closet. So you can take that thought to the closet and compare the thought to the closet, can't you? Now, is there anyone here who feels that you could not possibly do that? I'm sure there's no one here who could not do it. I'm sure of that. I'm sure that you all know you could do it. I'm sure that if you thought you couldn't do it, you would immediately just want to send out for help. Because the ability to recognize truth in these kinds of cases is a condition of human competence, of basic human competence. And so let's stay with these cases now for a few minutes. I know that these are not the interesting cases that many of you may want to go to immediately. Let's stay with them for just a few minutes. The structure is the structure of truth, and we learn it very early, and we learn it by experience. We learn to compare our thoughts and our expectations, the statements of others, with what we find to be the case. And if you watch children, they learn this very early, and they have no problem with it at a very early age. And of course, one of the things that children learn to do very early is to instruct their parents about the truth and falsity of various statements which the parents have made. They know that. This is not a deep, dark mystery. A child masters it. And if Johnny stole some cookies, and Susie comes and tells Mommy, Johnny stole cookies. Now Mommy sits down with Johnny and says, is it true that you took cookies? And if at that point Johnny says, what is truth? You see. You know what Johnny is doing. Johnny is being uncooperative. He is not responding to the point. And it is very important for us to understand that it is on the human agenda, right up close to the top, for everyone to be very careful about the truth. Because the truth is dangerous. And Johnny knows that if indeed it is established that he took the cookies, a certain course of action is in the wings. And so the little girl asked to define a lie in Sunday school replied, it is an abomination to God and a very present help in time of trouble. Because you see, our ability to negotiate with the truth. Now, all of that comes from the very simple, obvious nature of truth. For example, if you work in a place where you change shifts, you may have an inventory list. And when the shift change comes on, the one who's taking over may take the inventory list and go to the cabinet, and if you're a nurse, for example, may go and inventory the drugs or inventory whatever it is. It's a very familiar situation. And the person is able to look at the inventory, compare it to the reality which the inventory is about, and decide whether or not the inventory states what is the case. Isn't that true? And so I ask you to focus on that relationship between the inventory and what it is about. And if what it is about is as the inventory states, the inventory is correct. The guy checks you off, you can go home, watch the news. If it is not correct, there's a discussion. Right? It's very important to think about that. Now, you don't have to have a written piece of paper, you don't have to have language. This is a very important part of the story, folks, and I'm sorry to deal with it in such a superficial way. You can carry the inventory in your mind. It doesn't have to be written on a piece of paper. Language, let me just make a statement for those of you who are philosophically worried about these things. Language takes its semantic properties from the minds of those who use it. Meaning and truth are fundamentally properties not of pieces of paper or strings of phonemes, but of thoughts, ideas. Now, this is one of the problems in the background of the discussion about relativity of truth. Because in our time, the mind has been thrown away. It's been thrown away, and a lot of the philosophical search for truth proceeds on the condition that you can't talk about the mind in any intelligible way anyway, and you have to talk about language. It is the mind that provides the substance for truth. The mind in relationship to the objects which the mind deals with. Our culture lost the mind at the end of the 18th century at a philosophical level in the writings of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. It lost it as a subject matter of serious research and knowledge, and ever since has been trying to find it again. And language and behavior are, of course, the two main subjects that are proposed as the mind or as the access to the mind. more subtly perhaps brain chemistry. And I don't have time to go into all of that, and I'm sorry that I have to just skate over it. But these are offered as substitutes, and when you examine brain chemistry, behavior, and language at the level of naturalistic knowledge, you cannot find meaning, and you cannot find truth. But of course, when you go to check the inventory in the cabinet so that you can go home, you don't worry about those things. You know what you're thinking, don't you? There are 3 bottles of such and such in the cabinet. You're thinking that, and you actually know how to look in the cabinet and see whether or not that thought is true. You can compare your thoughts to the objects. So now my third point here is an attempt to just give you an abstract statement of what truth is. Truth is that peculiar relationship which obtains between a representation and what it is about, when what it is about is as the representation indicates. And I turn you back now and I say, every one of you don't need a course in philosophy, you don't need a course in linguistics, every one of you deals with truth and falsity constantly. Every one of you know exactly what it is. You're able to identify it, argue about it, refute it, defend it, question it. You know exactly what it is. And you cannot go anywhere in this discussion if you give up on that basic insight about what truth is and how it's present to you. If you give up on that, there will be no stopping place or no intelligibility in the discussion about truth. Why are we in fact at a loss about truth today? It's because, generally speaking, truth as it is in itself is not an intellectually respectable subject matter in the academic and learned world. Brain chemistry? Fine. Language? Oh, that's good. Behavior? That's good too. But it will never get you to anything that you will recognize as truth. So you see, there is a very serious problem about truth, because truth falls in a domain of reality and knowledge which is not intellectually kosher. Now, do people go on and act as if they know the truth? Sure they do. I always ask a colleague or fellow professional who says truth is relative, I say, do you believe that of the truth about your fringe benefits? That it's relative? That it depends on what you believe about it? Now, you know, they may choke it down and say yes. Or they may say, no, it's a power play. And if I've got enough power, what I say about my fringe benefits will stick, and if I don't, then what the administration says about my fringe benefits will stick. Just a power play. And if we go to the courts, just more power. Truth is not established in court. Decisions are reached, power is exercised. Well, that's another part of the long story. Now, let me just point out a very crucial matter here. Not all truth, of course, is verifiable in the way I've suggested. You can establish the truth of your belief that your shoes are in the closet in the way I've described. But it's not possible to establish most of the truths that we're interested in the academic world in that way. We have to use other means of evidence. The basic laws of logic are designed to enable you to get from true premises to other statements that must be true if your premises are true. That's the standard stuff for those of you who know a little logic. And so it is possible by using logic to proceed beyond things that can be directly verified. When I use the phrase directly verified, I do not write into it the history of empiricism, which is responsible in large measure for the mess we're in about truth and knowledge. Our culture has not escaped the effects of Hume's critique of knowledge on the assumption of empiricism, that is, that all meaningful statements, all ideas come from sense perception or feeling. And if you have bought that, then of course truth goes out, personality goes out, value goes out, sets go out, universals go out. Everything goes out actually that makes human life worth living. I mean, Hume knew that. And that's why he got sick with his own philosophy and disoriented and said, well, I have to get up out of the philosophical armchair and walk about, play a little backgammon, chat with ladies, have dinner, and I feel better. Right? But that's because when he moved into the realm of action, he had to step out of the philosophical armchair that had dissolved his whole world around him. So when I speak of verifiability, I do not mean empirical verifiability. I mean verifiability by direct experience, and direct experience is not to be understood as Hume tried to understand it, and later philosophers commonly known as positivists or logical empiricists or whatever. But what we have to understand is that truth still persists in cases where you can't directly verify it. Let me give you a parallel. Take the relation of next to. Now, if I ask you, is the pepper next to the salt on your table? You would be able to answer me one way or the other, wouldn't you? And how would you be able to do that? Well, by looking at the pepper and the salt. Do you know what the relation of next to is? Well, you probably haven't thought much about it, but if you thought about it a bit, I expect you'd come out fairly clear on it. It is not a precise relationship, and indeed there is some vagueness in it. Do things have to be right up against one another to be next to? Well, that's a clear case, but maybe if they were a fraction of an inch away, they would be next to. Suppose the salt was on one side of the table and the pepper on the other side. Would that be next to? Probably not. Next to normally means some kind of spatial proximity, but it isn't very precise. If there is, however, a plate between the salt and the pepper, you won't say it's next to the pepper, because it isn't. So, for example, we might say, is Mars next to the Earth in the solar system? What would the answer be? Well, you would be prepared to draw some distinctions. You would say, if you mean there is another planet between them, then Mars is next to the Earth. If you mean it's right up against it, no, it's not next to it. And so you can draw distinctions, right? Now here's my point. You know what next to is, you apply it, you learn it by observation, and as a result, you can apply it far beyond observation. Truth is the same way. Truth is not limited to observation. It does not depend on observation any more than next to does. Now then, if I've succeeded in getting this before you, let's go on and make some statements about it. And right at the bottom of your sheet, I say truth is absolutely relentless, ruthless, and unrelenting. I mean, it just stands there. It does not change because of people's beliefs about it, how they vote on it, what their tradition says, or anything of the sort. If your gas tank is empty and you believe that it has gas in it, you can vote on it, have a cheerleading session, develop a tradition. You can do anything you want to, and your car will still not run. Truth is absolutely ruthless and unrelenting. You cannot change any truth by believing one thing or another about it. Now you can change things if it is within your power to modify what your belief is about. For example, if you say my tank has gas in it and it doesn't, then you can, as it were, make that sentence true by putting some gas in the tank. But you cannot do anything about it by just believing or wishing or hoping or taking attitudes or cheering or booing or anything of that sort. Truth itself is absolutely ruthless and unrelenting. Now compare that to belief. Now, I note at the bottom here, I must hurry on, that truth is no respecter of persons. It doesn't matter if it's Joe that believes it, or John that believes it, or Betty, or Bill Clinton, or Newt Gingrich, or anybody else. It will not go from truth to false just because a different person believes it. Now, belief, of course, is different. Belief, I have very simply stated at the top of the other side of your page there, is a readiness to act as if something were so. Belief has a lot of properties that are true for representations that are true. For example, a belief is about something. It is selective in the way any representation is. A belief always has a definite kind of object. If I believe that there is gas in my tank, I'm not in other facts, for example, about what's happening on the freeway or elsewhere, what's going on here, is irrelevant to it, because that belief is a representation which selects a specific object. The difference now between belief and truth is that they vary independently. You can believe what is true, you can believe what is false. There is no necessary connection between belief and truth, and thereby hangs many a tale. So you actually hear people talk as if somehow they varied with one another, that believing made things true. I've heard people speak in such a way that it would seem that it was impossible to have a false belief, because after all, if you believe it, it's true for you, isn't it? And you have to admit that that's a pretty radical interpretation of truth. Or perhaps it's relativized to groups, perhaps professional organizations. Whatever all of the world's leading philosophers believe must be true. You're not likely to hear that said, because the world generally believes, as you may have heard, that if all the leading philosophers were laid end to end, they would still not reach a conclusion. But if you hear it said all the world's leading microbiologists, then perhaps that would be more impressive. But the truth of the matter is, all of the world's leading microbiologists can believe what is wrong. So there is no correlation between belief and truth that is automatic. If you're going to establish a correlation, you have to go beyond belief. You have to move towards evidence. Now, quickly, why then is it that truth is so threatening? And it is because truth claims to truth, and truth carries an authority that belief does not. If you have a belief and you want to have it to have authority, you have to create some special circumstances that will give it authority. Merely the fact that it is a belief doesn't command any respect. I don't get no respect, Rodney Dangerfield says, and that's exactly the way it is with truth. You tell someone you believe something, and well, that's interesting. And they may make a note of it, because if they have to deal with you and you really believe it, it's going to make a difference. Because belief does make a difference in our behavior. And what we believe rigorously is correlated with how we will act. And I really think we need to say that it is not true, as is often said, that we don't live up to our beliefs. I would just propound to you a suggestion to think about. We always live up to our beliefs. You can't do anything else. Now, what you can do is not live up to the beliefs you profess. And a lot of our problems in life are created by the fact that there are sometimes reasons to profess beliefs which we don't have. And so this creates a further gap between belief and reality. But we are really concerned about truth claims, and I put down here this perversion: you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you flee. And we all feel that deeply. And that's actually something that Jesus seems to have had in mind when he said, people love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. Right? They want to hide. And the truth is hard to live with, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. How has it come up? Well, there's more to be said than I can possibly say on this, but I want to say a few things that might provide a ground for further exploration for you. First of all, there is the fact that, as I've already noted, truth is often not directly inspectable, and yet we believe. And this creates a problem for us. Because if we don't know, if we're not firmly fixed on what truth is and how we handle it, and how we handle evidence, then we're going to wonder about whether or not truth is there when we can't directly inspect it. And we will notice things like most or many of our beliefs do not refer to things that we can directly inspect. And then we may get bothered about this and start talking about, well, I don't know about true, but I know about true for me. And that phrase comes back in, true for me. That means simply, I believe it's true. But of course you can believe something is true when it is false. And now then, when you have whole knowledge industries built on things that you can't directly verify, it is very tempting to loosen the word truth and allow it to float over to what all right-thinking people believe. And then we can worry about who the right-thinking people are. Invariably, it will move into an authority system. And I want to say this now. I said something about this last night. I want to say it again. And I hope you'll understand that it is not meant as an attack, but an attempt to simply say how things really are. What prevails today, roughly speaking, in the intellectual world, is an authority system. It works by authority. Take my own profession, philosophy. Take something like what is called Gödel's proof, that you can't write an all-inclusive and complete system of rules for elementary arithmetic that is consistent. I doubt that 3% of people in professional philosophy today could work through that proof. And probably not 1% of them have ever actually done it. And yet they all believe it. That's authority. That's authority. That isn't working things through on your own and arriving at your conclusion. That's authority. There's nothing wrong with authority. We should just recognize when things are working by authority and when they're not. The same is true, in perhaps a less degree, of most of the things that might be regarded as the most favored positions in professional philosophy today. Now these spill over into law, into journalism, and in all of the other professions. So this first point has a lot of implications to it. The second point, I've already discussed it briefly, the same thing. The loss of thought or empiricism, as it has affected our theory of the mind, leaves any idea of truth or meaning wandering, and we try to replace it in various ways, and that invariably goes over into language. And of course language is relative, isn't it? Language is relative to culture, and culture is relative to history, and perhaps persons of various kinds. So that's important. I'm not going to try to reply to these in a moment because I want to stop in just a second and elicit discussion if we can. And then fourthly, I mentioned something that is really worthy of all of our attention, those of us who live in the academy, and that is the rise of sociology of knowledge. Now, sociology of knowledge is in fact not a sociology of knowledge at all. It is a sociology of knowledge, of research, of ignorance, stupidity, superstition, all kinds of things that go into the mix that make up what a society might take as knowledge. The problem is that it contributes further to this idea that all there is to say about what passes for knowledge is some causal story about how people came to accept it or believe it. And to the minds of many people today who have been taken in by the full range of the history of the theory of knowledge in our culture, which can really be put under one main term, and that is representationalism, heavily influenced by empiricism. For many, many people, they believe in their hearts that the only story to tell about anything that presents itself as truth or knowledge is a story about how people came to believe it. Again, another triumph for Nietzsche, who really said that that was all you could do for any prevailing ideas or values, is tell the story about how they came to power. Well, of course, except in the context where we're worried about our academic self-righteousness, I think all of us will admit that multitudes of people can be wrong. 6 million Frenchmen can be wrong, right? Or whatever the numbers are. There's no safety in numbers so far as truth is concerned. And that is because I believe all of us still have in the back of our minds, we are haunted by that basic idea of truth that we all come to know as children. And we keep thinking about, well, multitudes might believe what is not really there. And I include here the little passage from Exodus, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Just one final observation, and I'm sorry I'm taking more time than I wanted. One final observation. Truth will not set you free. And we have to say that because this is one of the, perhaps that is the statement more than any other that is written on the walls of old buildings at universities. You would not be able to write it on the wall of any new building you build on this university. Prove me wrong. And I'd be very happy to be proven wrong. That's because the effect has been, the effect of some of the things I've been talking about, has been to deflate the importance of truth. Now you get an education. I don't know what it is, but you get. You get credits, certifications, people to write letters for you, go up the ladder of advancement, more standardization without standards, I'm afraid. And power perhaps is the last word in the way things are practiced now after truth has been abandoned. But we have to say, no, truth will not make you free. Many of these statements now, you don't even have to know the truth, apparently. On the elevator in the Humanities building at USC, whoever donated the elevator wanted to say a word. And so the word they said was a little plaque in the elevator. You have ... the truth will make you free. Period. Who said that? Jesus never said that, folks. A lot of people think he did, but he didn't. He said, if you continue in my word, then you are my disciples indeed, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Now, if you told someone you're in charge of that if they washed the dishes and swept the floor, you'd give them money and they could go to the movie, would you regard yourself as having said they can go to the movie? Jesus knew the truth would not make people free. He knew that it crushed people. What people need is not truth. They need truth, but that's not their problem. They're not in bondage by falsehood. They're in bondage to passion. And because they're in bondage to passion, they use falsehood to protect their projects. What we need is grace. What we need is community, is acceptance, is power. And we receive that, I believe, from a transcendental source which is ever present at hand. And that is a truth which can be verified. Thank you very much. And let's stop now and see if you have comments and questions back. I'd be delighted if you do, and I feel no need to prove that I'm right. I'd like to be right, but Unfortunately, I've been wrong. I once thought I made a mistake. Think about it. Are there any comments or questions, especially about our academic setting and so on? Yes.
Particularly concerning Christ himself, what would be maybe a starting point or an avenue if we were talking with someone and helping them to pursue truth of Jesus Christ?
Get them to be honest with themselves. Deal with truth in their personal lives. There is no other starting place. And that will be a big assignment for every person, to just start being truthful in their own lives. And now, there are other things that they can do if they have specific questions, like if they have a specific question about Jesus Christ, or about ethics in relation to Him, or ethics without Him, or whatever. That's a very common line of concern in our culture, because we basically come from that. So then you can deal with specific questions. But you can't. I believe we have to understand that we don't start with religious truth. We start with truth about ourselves. And it's by dealing with truth about ourselves that we then begin to go on to other things. It's like truth in engineering. If you don't need to build a bridge or something, you're not going to be led into truth in engineering unless you're doing it for a degree or something. But you have to have the need to go on to the other things. And of course, one of the things I firmly believe that as Christians we're not doing is trying to prove we're right. I don't think we're in that business. You just think of it this way: who cares if I'm right? Right? Is that an issue? No, it isn't an issue. And so let's just begin with the person and begin to help them accept the truth about themselves. Anyone else? Yes.
Talk a little bit about going from the observable and finding the truth to the unobservable. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how one would do that.
Well, for example, take just the simple relation of next to. We do it all the time. I'm sorry. Thank you. The question is, how do we go from the observable to the unobservable? And here again, I think we really must be careful and not make a big mystery of something very simple. For example, in astronomical research, we use the term next to all the time. And how do we establish what is next to next in a galaxy, for example? We certainly can't do that by direct observation, but there are ways of determining. For example, the discovery of Pluto was caused by the disturbances that it set up to the next planet in, which were observable. So we use various kinds of evidence, argument based on logical relationships, known facts, and that's the way we do it in any realm. And that's the way it is even with truths generally. For example, the truths of mathematics, very few of them are knowable by direct inspection, if you wish. And if some of you are involved in the philosophy of mathematics, I need to apologize to you and say, yes, I know there's a long discussion here. But very few at most are established by direct observation. An infinite number of them potentially can be established by proof. And we've established hundreds of thousands of them. Now sometimes we can't even track the way. There are individuals, there was a very famous Indian mathematician who could prove theorems, and no one could say how he did it. And so people are still working on how he did it. And some of them they've been able to figure out, and others they can't. But they know they're true by other means. But he was able to actually provide proofs of them. The mind is a fascinating thing, but it has that capacity. That's where reason comes in now. What is the check on that? Reason and rational standards is the check on it. We're not infallible in that domain. Basically, that's the way it works. Literary theory, you can't establish truths about, many of the truths about a text, for example, by observations. You have to do the analysis of data. You give reasons. You lay out your assumptions. You test those assumptions, and so on. Now, one of the things that I argue for, both philosophically, and I'm trying to impose on you here if you wish, is that that process of reasoning is itself an objectively validatable process. It isn't something, if you like the way you reason, well, it's fine. You know, I have to start my courses in logic by showing the students a valid argument and bringing out the fact that it doesn't matter what you think of the argument, it is valid or not in terms of its own structure. Are there other questions way back here, and then we have one here? Yes?
When you're talking about truth, you're talking about our belief in reference to something that is reality.
Let me stop you and say, when I speak of truth, I'm never talking about belief. So now, can you restate your question?
Our belief in truth, our belief, if we're true, we're aligned with reality.
That's right. If our beliefs are true, they enable us to integrate with reality in a way that is also comfortable for our will. Right. And that's the main function, of course, of belief beyond intuition, is to enable us to integrate our purposes with reality.
Okay, so then you mentioned that a lot of what is interesting is reality is not verifiable. So if I'm going to argue
by verifiable, I mean directly inspectable. Right.
So then how would one argue spiritual reality if there's an individual that is not recognized or believe in spiritual reality?
Well, I normally will sit down with a person who does not believe in that, and I will sit down and try to get them to talking about themselves, about their thoughts, their feelings, their choices, their reasons. And I've never found a person who isn't full of information about these aspects of themselves. And then I say to them, now what you've been talking about for the last 45 minutes is spiritual reality. That's spiritual reality. What is spiritual reality? It is, I give a definition, the spiritual is unbodily personal power. And of course then we can have a long argument about that. But, I mean, you have to, that's the way you work, basically. See, most people think spirit, what is spirit? It's vapor. It's a gas. Or it's a vacuum. So, really now, this is where, to go back to the talk last evening, I don't know how many of you were there, but, you know, I talked about how being a rational person makes heavy demands on things like your patience, your willingness to listen, and so on. And so this is a helping piece of work and a learning piece of work also. And that's the way you proceed. You define your terms, you collect evidence, and you proceed from there. Now you see, those of you who are Christians, when you say God is spirit, what do you mean? God is gas? God is vacuum? What is it? You have to give a specific meaning to that. And one of the reasons why we are in trouble is not just because some very false tendencies in interpreting knowledge itself has arisen and become historically triumphant, but because we have not responded. We have not taken the central terms in our vocabulary on which our practice is based and made sense of them. Right now, I've got a friend at USC in psychology who will not leave me alone. He is a rabid behaviorist, but for some reason he wants to keep discussing these issues about the spirit and the nature of personality or the nature of the person. I don't usually talk about spirit to him because it's enough to just get a thought. But you see, he will not be convinced because he knows that if he gives on this point, his professional career is on the line. And he knows that if he doesn't adhere to his very curious version of behaviorism, then he's got to rewrite his whole book, change his whole career, and so it gets heavy, doesn't it? See? And there's a lot of investment here. Does that help at all? That's the way I would proceed. Just go piece at a time. What is spirit? What is mind? Let's make sense of it. Let's deal with the objections and go on from there. And I think there's a very strong case for that, because I'm still waiting for anyone, when they start describing their life, to do it in chemical terms. Or even behavioral terms. They don't do it. Over here was a comment.
Yes, you mentioned something to the effect that usually when you ask people about truth, I can't remember if you were talking about truth or belief, the response that people normally give is how someone came to that belief.
Yes. They say within the current context, any idea of truth apart from true for me or true for our group is dismissed, and you get instead historical explanations of how we came to those beliefs.
So in response to that, do you think that a Christian testimony is a usable factor or something that shouldn't be used today?
Anything that you judge to be relevant with that person should be used. You can't run this by formula. And so you're going to listen to people and find out where they are. And you're going to respond to them where they are, and it may be that your testimony would be relevant. I would say that's going to depend on how they are related to you, probably. You know, a lot of people come to belief because of other people's belief. They sincerely do. That's absolutely true. In fact, most of the things we believe because other people believe them. You probably believe what you read in the newspaper this morning. Most of it. And so that's quite all right. And so sometimes you'll find a person, they may know you, and your standing and your surroundings may be such that if you have believed and experienced something, that will be a very serious point for them. On the other hand, you may meet a person who knows you, but who has very firm philosophical commitments, and you may need to deal with those first. And I suggest, if they are deeply troubled on this issue of what is the spirit and what is the mind, that you begin, just somewhat like in your case, you go with them, you get them to describing. Ask them things like, well, have you been disappointed lately? Most people will be able to give you some disappointments that they've had lately. And then you could get them to describe that. Look at its parts. See, that's the work of rational analysis, is always to break things into their parts and put them back into relationship with one another. And it's very productive work. Old Descartes was not a dummy when his little rules for the direction of the mind. I mean, they're good rules, and we should learn them, no matter what our position is. So I'm afraid that's not a very neat answer, but I think you have to consider the case and you have to respond to the individual. But in some cases that may mean a pretty interesting philosophical discussion. Other times it may mean an individual statement. Any other comments or questions? One more back here? Yes, please. And I think another over here. Yes. Yes, because it limits freedom. It limits freedom. If you accept something as true, you know that you cannot do certain things. Now, so it's a direct assault on the will. And now, by the way, if you want to see, again, I've mentioned Nietzsche, this is the third time. This man, whatever you may think of him, he was profound. And if you read the last section of his book on the genealogy of morals, you will see that he presents the belief in truth as the last vestiges of asceticism. And asceticism for him is the denial of the will, especially the will to pleasure. And he recognizes that this is, and he treats it as is often done. I mean, actually, if you read Nietzsche very well, you'll hear very little new on the campus. If you recognize, I mean, because he recognized, he saw that this is deeply connected to issues like the existence of God and so on. Because what it amounts to is invoking a power that is transcendent to the human will. And so when Derrida comes along and talks about his ontotheological version of reality, logocentrism he calls it, and the rejection of it, he's just taking a page out of Nietzsche's book. But it's very threatening. You see, there are only two values that are immediately accepted in American culture today. One is pleasure, sometimes called happiness. The other is freedom. If you want to do something, you should be free to do it. If it is pleasurable, why not? And these are the two unquestioned values of our civilization at present. Everything else has to justify itself. But these can only be justified if they involve some kind of self-limitation. They are ultimate. Pleasure and freedom. Can we just take the final comment over here?
I've always been very, very uncomfortable with someone saying we need to agree to disagree. Conviction and belief of understanding what truth is something to me which impels or drives you to try to share that with another if they disagree.
I think that's true, because we all sense the importance of truth. We're all essentially saying, well, gee, if this is true, this guy's in trouble. And because they may not like that.
I just wonder, in society, that value in and of itself, that you are willing to tolerate someone else's belief as it stands.
It's a very important value. It has disappeared in our culture. Tolerance is no longer a virtue in our culture. If you tolerate someone, you're apt to be spit in the face and told, thank you, I don't need your tolerance. I'm just as right as you are. Tolerance is no longer a virtue in our culture. And if you try to practice it, you'll find it very quickly. It's just like going to someone and forgiving them when they don't think they've done anything wrong. But now, see, I think we all know that tolerance is absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary, no matter what we call it. Because if not, we're just going to be a constant war of all against all. So then what we need is to find, and back to your statement, we have to agree to disagree. See, there's a certain logical point to that. Namely, if we can't agree on something, we can't even disagree, except just hate one another. If you mean disagreement where there's going to be a discussion, there has to be a common basis for that. And it's not a bad practice when you have a disagreement with someone to say, let's hold that for a moment and back up and see if there's anything we agree on. Because that then might enable us to deal with our disagreements in a way that is profitable and fair and, who knows, even loving. So it's a very important point. Now, I'm not sure I addressed your concern. Would you state it again?
Tolerance demand at times that we stop trying to convict one another of truth.
I think in cases it may. It may. But that's going to be a practical judgment. Because at some point, let me put it this way. Sometimes you see people engaged in debates about truth, and you listen a while and you realize they're not really concerned about helping other people. They're sticking up for their own self-righteousness. And we just don't need to get into that game. It will be totally unprofitable because the other person's already convinced of your unrighteousness anyway. So I think practically there may be. However, I do believe, as Augustine pointed out a long time ago, it is an essential part of love for our neighbor to try to help them to the truth. And I think that is essential. But as a practical strategy, there may well, and I think there will be times, where you're not going to address that very directly. And you may decide that the best way to lead this neighbor to the truth is to do nothing, except perhaps be there. Okay. Thank you very much.